This is Western Civ 1 at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young, your instructor. I want to continue our conversation about the ancient Near East today. And we're going to go a little bit forward in time here before we circle back in the next lecture to talk about some primary sources from these ancient Near Eastern civilizations. The first thing that we should note here is that there were some pretty massive changes that took place in the Near East around 1200 BCE. It's somewhat uncertain exactly what happened. The sources that we have are not voluminous, and the ones that we do have are quite vague. But there was a kind of status quo that was reached in the Near East around the 13th century BCE between the Egyptian Empire. Now, this is the New Kingdom of Egypt, and I said in the last lecture that in the New Kingdom period, the Egyptians had put together a standing army. They had crossed the traditional boundaries of the Pharaonic Nile River society, had conquered up here into the Levant region, what is now Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, places like that. And during this expansion, they ran into a newly emergent empire called the Hittite Empire, based here in Anatolia or Asia Minor. And the Hittites were relative upstarts. I mean, the Egyptians had already been around almost 2,000 years at this point, ruling over the Nile Valley. And the Hittites were, also predated by a long ways by the other civilizations of the Fertile Crescent down here, which we've talked about. One of the keys to Hittite success was they were one of the earliest civilizations to produce iron technology, especially in weapons. And iron is an important factor in history. In fact, from about 1200 BCE on, we refer to the Iron Age as opposed to the Bronze Age, which preceded that. And it's a bit of a mystery why, or it's not a mystery, but it's worth trying to understand why bronze came before iron. And the simple fact is that iron is much more difficult to make into a usable commodity than bronze is. It requires much higher temperatures. You can't just light a fire and put in a piece of raw iron and expect it to be turned into something that can be shaped. Iron comes in the form, usually iron ore, that is, of these kind of orange rocks. And you have to heat those up to tremendously high temperatures, which will then render iron into something, more akin to the metal that we, use in our everyday lives, or steel. Steel is, a later development, adding certain chemicals to iron. But iron can be shaped into plows or swords or other instruments that are highly usable, but it takes very, very high temperatures, and it took the civilizations of the ancient Near East quite a bit longer to produce iron than almost 2,000 years than they did to produce bronze. In any case, the Hittites had iron technology at their disposal, and with iron swords and other things, they managed to conquer this fairly large territory. And in the 13th century BCE, they arrived at a treaty with the pharaohs in Egypt, where they agreed to kind of share the Levant to maintain the territories that the two had conquered. But it was not long after this that both of these great empires took a massive hit. Now, how did this happen? Well, that's a really good question. Egyptian sources refer to simply, they talk about the sea peoples. These seem to have been invaders who came from the Mediterranean Sea, pirates who attacked the lands that were occupied by the Egyptians, especially these lands over here in ancient Canaan or the Levant region. And took over and pushed the Egyptians all the way back into the Nile Valley, thus taking control of all of the empire that they had conquered in the previous centuries. They also completely destroyed the Hittite Empire and dealt the death blow to the civilization as it was known in Anatolia here. And then from Greek sources, from lots of Greek evidence, we can understand that the Greek world was hit very, very hard by this too. Now, who were the Sea Peoples and why were they so ruthless in attacking all of these civilizations? The answer is not known exactly, and is the source of a great deal of speculation among scholars of ancient history. It is probable that the Sea Peoples were not a single people. That is, they didn't come from a single place. This is probably something that built over time and probably began with a natural disaster of some kind, a famine, a food shortage somewhere, which made people desperate, and they attacked the surrounding regions, which made those unstable, and that instability led to more people being adrift and taking to piracy, and eventually this process just engulfed the entire eastern Mediterranean. Now, the pharaohs did manage to hold on to rule in Egypt for a couple more centuries, but they were weakened significantly to the point that they were eventually conquered. First, the Nile Valley was conquered first by people from over here in the Sahara region, Berber peoples, who may have been kind of the last remnant of the Sea Peoples. I don't know, or took advantage anyway of this chaotic situation. Later, they were conquered. Egypt was conquered by peoples from the south, this region down here called Nubia, modern-day Sudan, and they, set themselves up as pharaohs for a time. But the long-term trend here was just political fragmentation for several centuries. We'll talk when we get to Greece about the Greek Dark Age, as it's called, which was started by this, this chaotic period of the Sea Peoples. So we don't know exactly. But this did give opportunity for other empires to arise and take control of places that had formerly been conquered by the Hittites or the Egyptians. And the most important of these emerging empires was the empire of the Assyrians. Now, we do know a fair amount about the Assyrians. This is an empire based in northern Mesopotamia. So over here on the northern part of the Tigris River, upstream from Hammurabi's base down here in Babylon, the city of Nineveh in particular, which interestingly is not on this map. I'm not sure exactly why. It was one of the chief cities of Assyria. We know about the Assyrians because there's a fair amount of artwork that has survived from the Assyrians and also some written texts. We can see, for instance, this type of artwork, both freestanding sculpture and what is called relief sculpture. That is a sculpture on a background here where the sculpture is in the relief off of the main background. And invariably, Assyrian sculpture is about war. And their texts, the texts that survive, written in cuneiform from the Assyrians, is mostly about war as well. This was a very bellicose, warlike people who celebrated their military accomplishments with aplomb, who conquered lots of territory and subjected peoples to their rule. How did the Assyrians do this? Well, they did it with military innovation. First of all, they used the technique of combined arms. Combined arms means that they didn't rely, primarily on one type of fighting force, like the New Kingdom pharaohs, the Egyptian Empire pharaohs, had relied almost entirely on their mounted chariot warriors to fight against other people. Well, the Assyrians did have chariots, but they also had a highly trained, very effective infantry, that is foot soldiers. In fact, the elite soldiers were all part of the infantry. They also had artillery. You can see here somebody shooting, an Assyrian soldier shooting an arrow. They had different kinds of weapons. They also had siege technology, maybe for the first time in history, so they were able to take on even well-fortified cities and not just starve them into submission, but actually erect siege towers and other things that would allow them to take control of those cities or scale the walls of those cities. And they used all of these in tandem so that it wasn't just one type of fighting force, but several used at the same time. This is how the Assyrians conquered so much territory. The other thing that bears mentioning here about the Assyrians is their unique style of ruling. The Assyrians were brutal not only in their warfare, but in the way they treated conquered peoples. Put simply, the Assyrians intended to wipe out the peoples they conquered socially and culturally and to forcibly assimilate other people into the Assyrian civilization. To do this, when they conquered a territory, they would select people from that society, usually women of childbearing age and men who had necessary skills, who were blacksmiths or other things that were, had high utility, and they would take those people away from their homeland back into the heartland of Assyria, or resettle them at least in some other part of the empire. They would forcibly marry them, and by marry we can really use the term rape. That happened frequently with Assyrians. They committed mass rape, impregnated the women with Assyrian children, and by dislocating the people from their original place of birth, they would, within a generation or so, effectively destroy the culture of that place. They also brought colonizers in, settlers, forcibly intermarried with the local populations, and again, used that as a means of cultural destruction. Now, this whole strategy has been condemned in the modern day as cruel. We could even, perhaps throw around terms like ethnic cleansing or genocide or something like that to talk about the Assyrians' tactics. They were terrible, and certainly people suffered under the Assyrians. But this was an effective way to put together a fairly cohesive empire, and the Assyrian Empire, as you can see, was huge. Extended all through Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent, down into Egypt, which they conquered in the 8th century BCE, up into Asia Minor, and all the way over into this region called Persia here, to the east of the Persian Gulf. It was it was a fairly cohesive empire for a couple of centuries. Now, one of the things that we should also note about the Assyrians is that they were despised by the people they conquered, by other people who were scared of them, and they had good reason to be frightened of the Assyrians. And we can glean from ancient sources some of these attitudes. One of the most interesting is the biblical book of Jonah from the Old Testament. If you may be familiar with the story, Jonah was this guy who was asked by God, commanded by God, in fact, to go and preach to the people of Nineveh and to tell them to stop being so wicked and horrible. Jonah's response was to run in the other direction. He wanted no part of going to Nineveh. He was frightened to death of the Assyrians. He didn't like the Assyrians. He hated them, in fact. And so Jonah went the other way. So he's over here in Palestine. He got on a boat and sailed out into the Mediterranean Sea. And God, he couldn't run from God. God sent a storm, which nearly capsized the boat. And Jonah said, well, I don't want all of you to die, so throw me overboard because God's angry with me. So they did this. He was swallowed by a gigantic fish. And finally, while he's in the belly of the fish, after 3 days, he's like, okay, God, fine, I'll go to Nineveh. I'll do what you want me to. And often we stop the story there, where he goes to Nineveh and preaches to the people and everything. But what comes after that is, I think, even more interesting and more revealing of the kinds of attitudes that people had about the Assyrians. Jonah goes and preaches to them. He tells them they need to stop being so wicked, they need to repent. And then he gets out of town. He flees. He leaves. Thinking, it seems, that God is going to destroy them, going to destroy the Assyrians. That's what he wants. And he figured, look, if I can get out of here after telling them they need to stop being wicked, if I can get out of here with my life, that's great, because God's going to destroy the Assyrians. And in the last chapter of Jonah, Jonah is up on a hill overlooking Nineveh. Now, we learn from that text, or the text reveals that the Assyrians listened to Jonah and in fact heeded his message and said, okay, you're right, we are terrible, and we need to be better. And so they repent. The king of the Assyrians, it says, put on sackcloth and rubbed ashes on his face and felt so terrible about all the horrible things he had done that he was willing to debase himself before God. And here's Jonah sitting up on this hillside with a kind of stadium view for the destruction of Nineveh. And it doesn't happen. And he then is angry with God. And he even says to God, look, this is exactly what I didn't want to happen. I wanted you to destroy the Assyrians. And the whole text ends with Jonah just being really angry with God and not learning his lesson. Now, if Jonah was far more frightened of the Assyrians than he was of God, that tells us something. And the fact that he was angry with God for not destroying the Assyrians also tells us something about how people felt about the Assyrians. The Assyrians, it seems, stretched themselves a little too thin, and ultimately one of the peoples they had conquered, the Chaldeans based down here in Babylon, managed to put together their own army, came up to Nineveh, destroyed the city at the end of the 7th century BCE, and took the Assyrians' place as the dominant power in the Near East. And the Assyrians were forcibly assimilated into the new Babylonian culture. The Babylonian Empire lasted for only a few decades, and they too were replaced by the Persians. Now, we need to talk about a couple, and I'll say something about the Persians later on here, because they're important for the story of the Greeks. But we need to talk about a couple of other peoples who lived during the Iron Age. One of the most important of these is the Hebrews, not because the Hebrews were a great empire like the Assyrians. At its height, the kingdom of Israel, as it was called, encompassed only a small territory on the coast of the Levant, and they were beset by various enemies. The people of Philistia, as the Hebrew Bible tells us, the people of Phoenicia, resisted the advance of the Hebrews. So if they were not terribly important geopolitically in the ancient world, we might ask why they should be mentioned here in a Western Civ course. Well, the answer to that is their cultural contribution. They came up with the notion of monotheism, or they were, some of the earliest practitioners of monotheism. They worshipped a god called Yahweh, or rather, that's the way that's often pronounced. We don't know exactly how they pronounced in the ancient world. We can just detect this from the way that the name of God that is stated in the Hebrew Bible, that it was probably pronounced something like that. However, the Hebrews so respected the name of God, they probably didn't use it very often. But their God was Yahweh, and Yahweh was different from the types of gods that other civilizations of the ancient Near East had. Specifically, those gods, were not, although they competed with other gods, were not concerned about being the only god worshipped by a particular people. Although the cities of ancient Greece and probably some of the cities of Mesopotamia had their patron gods or goddesses, their city gods, as it were. They did, people did acknowledge the presence of other gods and worshipped other gods and probably had temples to other gods. Yahweh, at least from what we can discern from the Hebrew Bible, was a god who insisted that the Hebrew people worship only him. Now, the biblical text is complex. It's one of the most important texts we have for the ancient world. It gives us a history of the Hebrew people. That history is probably quite unreliable. This history is similar to the kinds of histories we find for other peoples. That is, a legendary ancestor, a founder, in this case in the Hebrew Bible, the figure called Abraham. There's also, an important period that is recounted in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Exodus, where the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians for a time. They were led out of that on the Exodus, as it's called, by the prophet Moses. They were ruled over for a time by people who were called judges, and later they had a kingdom under kings. under Saul and David and Solomon. This kingdom was divided then into two, the kingdom of Judah to the south and the kingdom of Israel to the north. The kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in the 8th century BCE, and the kingdom of Judah was able to hold on and remain independent, but then it too was conquered in the early 6th century BCE by the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, the ones who had defeated the Assyrians. True to form, the people of Israel were carried off captive into Assyria. They were forcibly assimilated. The people of Judah were also taken back to Babylon, and Judah itself was destroyed. But because the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians, who were far more tolerant than the Babylonians were, many of these Hebrews, who were also starting to be called Jews after the kingdom of Judah, were allowed to return and rebuild their kingdom, although they were subordinate to the Persians. They were later, these kingdoms were independent in some periods and conquered in some periods later by the Greeks under Alexander the Great, and then by the Romans. And many of these Hebrews, or Jews, adherents to the Hebrew religion, spread all through the Mediterranean and the Near East and lived in what's called the diaspora, or the exile. And these Jews are going to show up at different times in Western civilization and be a really interesting and at times important people. The greatest contribution, though, is this notion of a single God. And the Hebrew Bible is, by turns, quite clear and somewhat vague on this score. In the earliest parts of the Bible, at least as we can discern them, the Bible was not all written at once. It was written over many centuries. And in the earliest parts of the Bible, the Hebrew authors seem to acknowledge the presence of multiple gods, but with the stipulation that the Hebrews are to worship only Yahweh, not the other gods. Later on in the Hebrew Bible, we get the notion that other gods are not real, and that the Hebrew God is the only God who is real. That is a change that happened at some point, it seems, in the development of the Hebrew religion. There's also this other notion, which has a real impact on Western civilization, that the Hebrews, especially after they were conquered by the Babylonians and the Assyrians, later by the Greeks and the Romans, that God would send a deliverer to deliver them from their oppressed situation, much as he had chosen Moses, the ancient prophet, to lead them out of Egypt. He would bring another deliverer called the Messiah, Hamashiach in Hebrew, and that this deliverer would, bring them back to independence or something like that. There were lots of different messianic traditions. There are some texts in the Hebrew Bible that talk about this Messiah figure, others that were in other texts in the ancient world. And of course, the most famous and long-lasting Messiah claimant in the ancient world was Jesus of Nazareth, but he was far from the only Messiah claimant. There were lots and lots of different ones, some who looked very different from Jesus. So we will bring up that topic again when we talk about the rise of Christianity later on in the course. Another people we should mention, although somewhat briefly, are the Phoenicians. If we go back to that last slide, Phoenicia, you can see, is this region just to the north of the ancient kingdoms of the Hebrews. Phoenicia was a seafaring civilization centered on these key cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. But they spread all through the Mediterranean. Here's a map, and this map is in French, actually, so you may have a hard time reading it. But a map of the western Mediterranean, and all of these names here are Phoenician colonies that were organized at some point in the ancient world. The most important of these was the city of Carthage here in what is now Tunisia. Carthage was founded by people from Phoenicia, but later became independent, and we'll talk about the Carthaginians when we talk about Rome, because they emerged as a great rival to the Romans for power in the Western Mediterranean in the second half of the first millennium BCE. In any case, you can see how prolific these Phoenicians were at founding these colonies. This is because they needed them for the purposes of trade. The Phoenicians were the great seafaring merchants of the ancient world. They were skilled seafarers. There's good evidence that Phoenicians made it not only all through the Mediterranean, but sailed out into the Atlantic, went up into the British Isles, probably in order to procure tin, which is found in some abundance there and was needed to make bronze. There's also evidence that the Phoenicians made it as far as the eastern coast of the Americas. There's a site, an archaeological site in Pennsylvania, that is probably a Phoenician site where these seafarers went. The greatest cultural contribution, and the main reason we mention the Phoenicians at all, is the contribution they made in the alphabet. They were the first of all peoples to produce a writing system that was based on sound, the sound that a language makes. This is a far simpler way to write. It is limiting in the sense that you actually have to be able to speak the language to read it. But the Phoenician alphabet, unlike the cuneiform system or the system of hieroglyphics, which the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians had developed anciently, had only 22 characters, which meant that a person could learn it far more quickly, and it was far more flexible in its usage than the very complicated system of symbols in cuneiform or hieroglyphics. And so it's not surprising then that this phonetic type of alphabet ended up being adopted by most of the other peoples of the ancient Mediterranean, including especially the Greeks, who modified it. The Phoenician system did not have symbols for vowels. That's one thing to note. The Greeks were the first to come up with symbols for vowels. Phoenician is a Semitic language, and so it's related to Hebrew and Arabic and some of these others, and the Hebrew alphabet, for instance, is derived and actually very close to the Phoenician alphabet. The characters look very similar. So that was the Phoenicians' chief cultural contribution to the ancient world. I said that we would talk about the Persians. Well, I'm going to actually stop the lecture there. We'll pick up the Persians when we get to the Greeks. And so this lecture was on these other civilizations of the ancient world. In the next lecture, we will go on and talk about, kind of circle back to ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia and look at some evidence from primary sources that will give us a more in-depth look into these ancient civilizations, and we'll kind of run the full gamut of these civilizations from ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, up through the Assyrians and some of these later civilizations. So I will interact with you online. Thanks.